Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Zach Love, Director of Communications at Rare, and we're coming to you live from the B, which is a training center for students of behavior and environment here at Rare's right outside Washington. I am joined by Kevin Green and Katie Williamson, two members of the team. We are joined across the pond by a couple of our friends, Carol Ryan and Cody Park. Hi, guys.
Hi, afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. So before we dive in, I just want to do a few housekeeping notes. So over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be discussing how behavioral science can expand on the toolkit used by practitioners in conservation and environmental health. So there will be some audience participation through some polls, but due to the keep this to a very tidy, so we're going to keep we're not going to do that. If you have questions, feel free to submit them to the Q&A function, and we will be sure to get back to you in a post-webinar communication. And if you participate in the Twitter about the webinar, please do so. Follow us at the hashtag #BehaviourForNature, American behavior. We're just trying to save character space, and the number change for nature. All right. I'm going to get the volume up a little bit. All right. Thank you for joining us. So just recently, the Behavioral Institute produced this document, this toolkit, Change for Nature, Behavioral Science Toolkit for practitioners. And it 15 strategies to help practitioners behavior change, tips of how to apply them. And it just so happens that the release of this new resource comes almost at the same time as the United Nations global assessment on biodiversity, which painted a very dire picture for global biodiversity and describing much of the problem to whether it's fishing, deforestation, habitat loss, climate change, pollution of land and so Kevin, this really couldn't be.
That's right, Zach. Most of the environmental challenges of our time they share at least something common that just solve them, start behaving differently, shift the way that they're using their natural resources. So this report sort of confirms that in no terms. The good news is we're taking notice as a result of the IPBES report, and some governments are even now committing that biodiversity loss is as high a priority now as climate change.
So let me go over to you. You say that you are expanding the conservation or environmentalist toolkit. What do we mean by that? What can we be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, the current toolkit, the conventional toolkit, and when I say that, I mean various forms of rules, regulations, or material and financial incentives, or awareness-raising campaigns. That's certainly not a bad one. They can often be the most effective tools we have. In particular, bans, quotas, and strong financial incentives can be very effective. So we need to keep on using those when they are most effective. But of course, they're not a silver bullet. So regulations can be politically difficult to enact or hard to enforce in real-world situations. Financial incentives can often backfire and undermine sort of good intentions to act. And we also know that raising awareness often isn't enough to actually change behavior. So the application of behavioral insights can augment these tools, it can make them more effective, but it can also add additional, more novel strategies of great value for practitioners on the front lines of conservation and other environmental issues. So the strategies that we offer in the toolkit try and do this in a few ways. So firstly, they attempt to take greater account of the context in which people are making decisions and behaving. So this reflects the fact that our choices and actions are not solely driven by internal factors, in other words, values, motivations, attitudes, etc., but also very much shaped by our physical environment and our social surroundings as well. Secondly, we try and put a strong focus on more sort of non-conscious psychological processes, so things like mental shortcuts or cognitive biases, which do shape our decision-making and behavior rather more than we tend to realize. And then thirdly, we put a strong focus on actual behavior. And when I say that, I mean as distinct from attitudes, awareness, and so on. So for example, you might know that eating a veggie burger helps cut greenhouse gas emissions, but that doesn't mean you're actually going to do it. So we need to find approaches that help actually changing behavior rather than just raising awareness.
That's great. So let's go ahead and dive in, because what we want to do today is not walk you page by page through a resource, but instead we want to do some show rather than just tell. Carol, let me begin with you, with getting into some real life examples of how the toolkit can be used to help shift behavior. And let's start with one that people might be familiar with, and that's material science, one of the strategies outlined in the toolkit. Carol, can you give us an example of where we might enhance, or how we can enhance material incentives with behavioral insights?
Yes, absolutely. So this study was about getting hairdressers in Zambia to give out condoms to promote safe sex in their community. And they tried 3 different kinds of incentives to encourage this behavior: a small cash incentive, a larger cash incentive, and then the third incentive was a gold star sticker that was essentially put into the window front if you were giving out the condoms.
So we had 3 incentives here: small cash incentives, large cash incentives, and gold star. So this is going to be our first opportunity for audience participation. Everyone, I'm going to launch a poll right now. So which approach here was more effective? Small cash incentive, large cash incentive, or gold star? So everybody go ahead, weigh in. Give everyone a couple seconds, and we'll see we'll see what you all thought. This is cool, real time.
High pressure.
We can do some witty banter as we wait for people to weigh in.
Stakes are high.
Give everyone just a couple more seconds. Excellent. All right, let's see what you all thought. Slightly over half of you thought gold stars, and 27% thought small cash incentive, and 17% thought large cash incentive. So, Carol, tell us what actually happened?
Yeah, okay. So the majority did get it right. So as it turns out, the gold stars were the most significant incentive that was tried in the study. So well done to the audience.
They did give this out. All right, that's good. So why behind this? Why it went this way?
Yeah. So this study is a good example of how symbolic rewards can, in some instances, be more effective than monetary incentives. Symbolic rewards, like the gold stars in this example, can help to amplify social motivations that might otherwise have been crowded out by financial rewards. So in other words, these hairdressers took pride in and care more about showing their community that they're engaging with this positive campaign than about making some extra cash. And the implications of behaviorally informed incentives like this one are important for policymakers whose job it is essentially to decide on large-scale incentive schemes. But of course, it's equally important for NGOs and practitioners and other organizations that are using incentives in their day-to-day work as tools to encourage certain behaviors.
So Katie, let me go to you. How might we use this strategy in a conservation field or an environmental context? Could it work in those contexts?
Absolutely. So as Kara said, the goal here is really to signal these pro-social or intrinsic motivations. We really want to be mindful of how financial incentives might crowd those out, or even provide a kind of license to do a certain behavior because they're paying for it. In that case. So in the conservation world, we could see, for instance, we could give maybe a flag or a plaque or a badge, some other, in this case, so swapping that out for the gold stars. We could see that for giving that to maybe fishers or agricultural practitioners or farmers to kind of in exchange for certain good practices to like for their adhering to certain standards. So again, this idea of being able to show a degree of be proud of what they're doing and then show that visibly.
So if a small scale fisher sees another fisher with a brightly painted boat, they might inquire, understand what's going on, and maybe adopt that practice, be more likely to adopt that practice.
Right, and if that's, it's given kind of in the same way that an incentive is given, but that's something that we only, grant to people who have adhered to certain standards, it kind of marks them in a certain way, and might kind of help shift that behavior.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's worth knowing that there's some other ways we can boost material incentives in addition to these non-financial symbols, for instance, like lotteries and group incentives are also a really great way to do this.
Okay. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and get into number 2, let's take a look at another strategy in the toolkit. And this one is best represented in a case study about household solar panels. So Kevin, tell us a little bit about this one.
Sure. We've got another quiz for the listeners. So there's a study in Connecticut that's really interesting. A couple of researchers, Graziano and Gillingham, they saw an uptick in solar panel installations in Connecticut in some areas. And they were interested in learning what factors contributed to, what factors were most influential in whether or not people installed solar panels. So they measured a bunch of demographic characteristics, built environment features, things like that, to see what could explain the different clusters they were observing.
All right, we have our next audience participation opportunity. So let's go ahead and take a look at this poll. All right, everyone go ahead and take a few seconds. Which one of the following was more influential in a household purchasing solar panels? Either median household income, proximity to neighbors, race, or political affiliation. Go ahead, take a few seconds and weigh in. We could use it. That'll be the next one. Soundtrack. We're always looking to improve. All right, everyone can take a few more seconds. Still see a few weighing in. All right, let's end it there. And what did you all say? So again, over half of you going with proximity to neighborhood or proximity to neighbors, political affiliation about 27%, and median household income at 40%. Nobody going with race. Interesting. Okay, so Kevin, tell us what actually happened.
Well, we've got some expert listeners, so our work is going well so far. Right, so they found that the proximity to neighbors was actually, neighbors with solar panels installed was actually the most influential factor. And so these neighbor effects that they called them actually led to, it increased the average number of installations within a half-mile radius by 0.44, which seems small, but is actually pretty significant. In this case, was the most significant factor.
All right. So let's go. So let me go over to maybe a situation where the behavior isn't as prevalent. And a good example here could be moving people toward plant-rich diets. We can't go around saying that 90% of Americans are, or anywhere are vegetarians. So when the preferred behavior isn't as prevalent, what do we do in that case, Katie?
Sure, no, it's a really good question. So in this case, we really want to draw on dynamic norms, which is when we're talking about how behavior is changing over time and not just talking about these static observations or like the prevalence of a particular behavior. So in the case of eating less meat, there was this really great Stanford study that came out a couple of years ago where they tried saying to a group of people, over the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to eat less meat. And they found that to be more effective than just talking about how many people are currently making an effort to eat less meat. And then through that, really signaling that there's this change in behavior, particularly in the direction that we're looking for. So even if you have a small percentage, it's more about this growing trend that helps to signal that this norm is forming.
Toby, let me go to you. How might in other contexts?
So actually highlighting social norms and sort of related techniques like using social comparisons have been shown to be effective in quite a range of contexts. It's probably actually one of the most well-evident sort of behavioral nudge techniques. And actually quite interesting, I think, for this particular conversation, they're particularly relevant to promoting sort of pro-social or moral behaviors, and I would include within that category pro-environmental behaviors. And maybe even more so to issues relating to public goods or shared resources. So things like trying to discourage overfishing or encourage people to be more energy efficient. So the reason social norms are so relevant to these kind of situations is twofold. So first, we tend to reciprocate the behaviors that other people do to us. So we're more likely to act pro-environmentally or for the public good or for someone else's benefit if we know that other people are also doing the same thing. So for example, simply telling people that most other people reuse their towels in hotels, or telling people that most other people are using less energy in the household than they are, have both been shown to be pretty effective at encouraging those pro-environmental behaviors. But second, in a way, our peers, our neighbors, those overlooking our behavior, tend to sort of police our behavior in a way, essentially through peer pressure. So by making our actions more observable to the group, we're more likely to do the right thing. So a nice example of that actually comes from the UK, where government departments a number of years ago were encouraged to reduce their energy consumption within their own buildings. And in part, that was effective because they published a public league table on the energy use of the departments to create that sort of social comparison.
Excellent. Okay, so we've gone through now material incentives, behavioral norms, and then also dynamic norms, and depending on the context. So let's get into a third case study. Thank you. We're going to get into a third case study now, and this one is about a bike share study in Portland, Oregon, but the Behavioral Insights team actually was involved with this. So Kara, why don't you tell us a little bit about this study?
Yeah, exactly. So, like you say, this was a study that our team in the US ran in Portland. And the goal was to encourage more sustainable modes of transport. And specifically in this case, it was about getting people to sign up to the city's bike sharing scheme. So we designed leaflets that were distributed to a sample population, but essentially it was distributed to two distinct groups of households. One group were people that were living in an area where new docking stations had just been installed, whereas in the other group, we had people that had just moved houses to the area where the bike sharing scheme was operating.
Okay, let's pause there and give our audience another chance to weigh in. So this one, the bike sharing in Portland. So which was more effective at getting people to sign up for a bike share program? Flyers, people who live in an area where there are newly installed stations, or sending flyers to people who have just moved to the area? Let's give everyone a chance to weigh in. I would join. All right, give everyone a few more seconds. All right, let's see what people say. All right, so this one, a larger majority said flyers to people who had just moved to the area versus those people who live in an area where there are newly installed bike racks. So, Kara, why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so well done to the audience again. The majority was right. So we did find that telling people who had just moved to the serviced area was more effective. And so this study in particularly highlights the effectiveness of timely moments, which can be points of disruption, essentially, that force you to make a decision. But it can also be moments during which we're more receptive to information, messages, or other outside influences. And moving houses really is such a disruptive moment that forces you to make a decision about your new commuting and travel behavior. And therefore, it is a timely moment to get you to consider perhaps more sustainable modes of transport as well.
So big life changes. So Kevin, let me go to you. How might this work, knowing that this timely moment approach, how could this work in the context, particularly conservation or environmental issues?
Sure. So in the toolkit, we talk about this as a strategy to use timely moments, prompts, and reminders. And we've seen this approach to use prompts and reminders work well in a number of areas. For example, it's often used in get out the vote efforts here in the U.S., possibly other areas where political parties will actually send reminders to your mailbox, sometimes quite frequently, to remind you when to vote, and sometimes even asking you to commit to a specific plan, which relates to another strategy that's in the toolkit. And really the same thing can and has worked in conservation. So imagine targeting people when they're booking a flight or when they arrive at an airport about illegal wildlife trade that can happen in a particular destination where they're headed, or even something as simple as providing visible markers in natural habitats where hikers and walkers can see them, or something as kind of complex and hairy as helping communities rebuild after periods of disruption or natural disaster, which you don't, of course, ever want to wish to happen, but we can see as sort of timely moments to introduce new, more sustainable uses.
Excellent. All right, so those are three case studies that highlighted three of the behavioral strategies that are outlined in the new toolkit, Behavior Change for Nature. But now let's think about, so these were instances that were maybe local, household, individual behaviors. How can we think bigger picture to achieve maybe wide or systemic change? And Toby, let me go to you. Based on your work at the BIT, how can we then How can we scale this up?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something we think about a lot at the moment, actually. So, I mean, first thing to say is that you can actually achieve widespread change, sort of one small nudge or one campaign at a time. It is possible. It's this idea of sort of radical incrementalism, the idea that in aggregate, lots of small improvements can really start to add up. But of course, we can also try and sort of shortcut that process if we're a bit smarter about where we sort of direct our efforts. And I guess often that's a question of identifying the pressure points within communities or within markets so that a small change in behavior in one area can actually tip the balance and trigger bigger change. And I think probably the clearest example of that that we talk about quite a bit is the recent sugar tax in the UK. And so the way this works, essentially by putting a fairly modest tax on sugary drinks, of course, some consumers will therefore stop buying those drinks, but it tends to be pretty marginal. So only a small proportion of consumers would move away from those products. But if we're clever about how we set the threshold of that tax, that's often enough to motivate drinks manufacturers to then reformulate their drinks so that they're exempt from the tax. And of course, what that means is that we're then all drinking less sugar because the drinks themselves contain less sugar without actually necessarily needing to be one of those people that would have bothered to change products in the face of the tax. So by leveraging the behavior of a small proportion of consumers, you can really sort of tip the threshold and have bigger impacts in the market. And of course, that works with a tax, but the logic is just the same if you use some other non-financial tool, some nudge, some effective campaign to shift behavior. But the point is identifying where it is on the margins that would then lead to a slightly bigger sort of knock-on effect. And that needs obviously a bit of an understanding about behavior, but also understanding the market economics, understanding the dynamics within a community, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great example of kind of using a traditional tool with the behavioral insight. And let me follow up with you, Toby and Carol. So we're saying that we're trying to expand the toolkit with behavioral insights and working with policymakers. What has been the reception? Have policymakers been receptive to changing or adjusting tools and using behavioral insights?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it has been well received. I mean, it's still obviously somewhat early days in the grand scheme of things for these kind of techniques in the policy world. That said, thinking about it, much policy activity is ultimately about human behavior in some fashion. And so these tools are certainly useful in that regard and certainly being recognized as such. I guess the ultimate sign of success would be for BIT's demise as an organization. Obviously, in many ways, we don't want that to happen, but it would also speak to the fact that behavioral science would no longer be seen as a sort of novelty add-on and really be part and parcel of sort of standard thinking when you're thinking about policy. And, we're obviously not quite there yet, but certainly many governments and many ministries around the world are adopting these approaches. Certainly several departments in the UK have really established an excellent teams of their own. So, yeah, we hope it's here to stay and will become, part of standard thinking.
I like that. I think we're all kind of working toward a world where we no longer have jobs. All right, so before we close, I want to ask the panel about how our viewers and people attending the webinar today can take that next step. They've seen the webinar, they've downloaded the report. So what's next? How can they use it? Kevin, what do you think?
Sure. So in the back of the toolkit, there's a description of methodologies, both BIT's and RARE's approaches to applying these ideas in the field. And there's lots of different ways to do this kind of thing, even beyond that. Really, for any way that you're looking at it, the first step is really to define the behavior that you're seeking to influence or to change. So identifying that specific behavior and being as specific as possible, rather than sort of attitudes or awareness or values, as Toby mentioned in the beginning. Getting specific about the behaviors you want to change is kind of always the first step. Then we sort of spend a lot of time researching our particular audience that we're designing for, so that we know what will work in that very specific context. And then, when possible, using rigorous approaches to testing ideas, testing solutions, to learn about what's working and what isn't, and constantly refining to actually have an impact in the field. It's also really important to say, that we just want to sort of lower the barriers to kind of trying this stuff out. Anyone who's playing a role in addressing environmental challenges in their work is every day making decisions about how to influence behavior. So there are innumerable ways to try and incorporate some of this into those daily decisions, whether it's sort of rigorously or not. And at Rare, we're really setting out to make these strategies and the science that informs them really more accessible to everyone. So I'd say, if you want some help, give us a call or give the BIT team a call, but also feel confident to go out on your own and try some things, learn what works and what doesn't, and then make sure to keep us posted so that we can all keep learning.
Right. And with that, let me go ahead and share our contact information. We definitely encourage you on that point, encourage you to get in touch with us at the Center for Behavior and the Environment. You can email us at behavior@rare.org. Follow us on Twitter @rare_org. And be sure to get in touch with our friends at the Behavioral Insights team. You can email Toby at toby.park@bi.team. And be sure to give them a follow at @b_I_tweets. So thank you very much. Before we conclude, just a couple notes. We really appreciate everyone attending today. I want to give a big thank you to Toby and Caro and our friends at the Behavioral Insights team for joining us for this webinar. Right after the webinar, everyone attending should receive a survey in your email inbox. We would love it if you would take just a couple minutes. That's all it takes to fill that out. Give us some feedback so we can continue to improve. Talking about timely moments, I'm learning as we go.
Nice
Even I can apply these tools. And a quick plug: on May 30th, Rare's Fish Forever team, we're going to be hosting another webinar on how we can apply these behavioral insights to helping fishers adopt more sustainable behaviors, and how that plays into protecting coastal oceans. And how we're attacking that challenge in communities in which we work. So thank you all very much. I'm going to quickly share where you can download the report. If you go to rare.org/center, and you can download the report there. We encourage you to do so. Fill out that survey, and thank you all so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.